Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Mr. Harriton was a big, handsome man, not very old. He walked around the living room, sometimes speaking to his wife. She sat by the window, looking outside. An hour ago, their daughter Florence and Mr. Dormer had gone out together. Mrs. Harriton was thin and pale, always feeling weak. When Mr. Harriton spoke loudly or moved a chair, she put her hand on her chest, as if to calm her fast-beating heart. But she still smiled and answered cheerfully. However, her eyes showed worry because her husband looked unhappy and annoyed. "Isn't it time for dinner?" Mr. Harriton asked. "Our servants do whatever they want." "It is my fault," said Mrs. Harriton. "I asked them to wait 15 minutes. Mr. Dormer is out with Florence. She took him on one of her long walks." Mr. Harriton frowned. "She has too much freedom. Her manners are not good, and she acts too young for her age." "But she is still young," said Mrs. Harriton gently. "We agreed not to rush her into society too soon." Mr. Harriton coughed and looked unsure. "Yes, of course. But Morrison from Carnbraes told me today that Florence is not an ordinary girl. She is the heiress of the Harriton family." Mrs. Harriton waited quietly, knowing he would explain more if she did not ask. "In a year or two, Florence will be a beautiful woman. With her money, she must marry well. By the way, Mrs. Morrison said something rude about Mr. Dormer." Mrs. Harriton did not remind him that he was the one who invited Mr. Dormer to stay. Instead, she said, "Rude words are not worth your attention, Richard." "Yes, but it was annoying." She asked if it was dangerous to let a young stranger live with our daughter. Mrs. Harriton blushed. "Surely Mr. Dormer is not that kind of man?" "No, not exactly. He is polite and smart. But you must admit you are letting him and Florence spend too much time together. What if he tries to make her love him? What if they run away together?" Mr. Harriton looked worried. Mrs. Harriton smiled. "I trust Mr. Dormer, and Florence is too innocent for that. But you're right. If he were staying longer, I would keep Florence busy with her studies." Mr. Harriton relaxed. "Good. Florence must not marry yet. First, she must go to London and be introduced to society properly. Richard, is it necessary to make plans for things that won't happen for years?" Mrs. Harriton asked. She leaned back, closing her eyes, as if the thought of her simple, happy daughter becoming a high society lady worried her. Mr. Harriton quickly went to her side. "Emma, I have upset you, haven't I? You don't feel well. Did you go for a drive today?" "No, I didn't feel strong enough." "Ah, our carriage is not comfortable enough. I saw a new one in the newspaper, made especially for sick people. I will buy it for you." "Please don't," Mrs. Harriton said quickly. "I am happy with the one I have. And Richard, it worries me when you spend too much money." He patted her shoulder. "Nonsense. I never say no when it comes to your comfort." "No, you don't." But Richard, I must tell you, I am afraid. We have spent too much money in the last few years. Tell me the truth, are we spending more than we earn? Is that why you are secretly worried? She held both his hands and looked into his eyes. He sighed and finally replied, "You worry too much, my dear. Everything is fine. The money we spent will bring good returns soon. I do need some cash right now, yes, but it's nothing serious. Every businessman faces this. And I have put money into a great investment." Investment? Mrs. Harriton looked alarmed. He laughed. "I should not have called it that. I know the word scares you. But don't worry. It is a successful company, and I will make double my money. Emma, I am doing this for Florence's future. You should be happy." Mrs. Harriton tried to smile, but her worry was clear. Mr. Harriton became impatient. "Aren't we going to eat today? This is badly managed." Just then, the dinner bell rang. He took her to the dining room, where Frank soon joined them. Frank apologized for being late, and Mr. Harriton calmed down. The dinner went smoothly, and Frank talked cheerfully. But Mrs. Harriton noticed that Frank was not his usual self. Later, in the drawing room, Florence told her what had happened. While they talked, a servant brought the mail. Mr. Harriton quickly checked the letters, but there was nothing important for him. He sighed and sat down, tapping the table with his fingers while Frank opened his letters. Frank often received letters from a college friend, Willis, who lived in London. These letters were usually full of gossip, which Frank liked to read aloud. But this time, after reading, he simply folded the letter. "No news today, Mr. Dormer?" Florence asked. "Nothing good," Frank replied. "Willis writes that he lost money. He bought shares in a new company, but the company has failed. Many people have lost money because of a few dishonest men." Mr. Harriton took a sip of his tea and said casually, "These things happen often. People should be more careful." What was the company called? Frank looked at the letter and read the name aloud. Suddenly, Mr. Harriton's cup slipped from his hand. His face turned pale. He gasped for breath and then slammed his hand on the table. "It's a lie! A lie!" he shouted. His wife and daughter jumped in shock. Mr. Harriton realized his mistake and quickly tried to calm down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dormer. I don't know why I got so upset. Emma, sit down. Don't get nervous over nothing." "Florence, go to your mother," he said. His voice was so harsh that Florence stepped back in fear. With shaking hands, he lit a candle. "I have letters to write." "Excuse me." Then he left the room. Mrs. Harriton tried to stay calm and spoke softly. "I think your father invested in that company and is embarrassed to be connected to such a bad business." Florence felt relieved, and Frank, who didn't know much about Mr. Harriton's finances, thought about his own letters. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Florence coming to say good night. When she spoke, he stood up suddenly. "Good night and goodbye, my dear little friend. I have received a letter. I must leave early tomorrow. You will not see me in the morning. Florence was shocked. So soon? Oh, Mama. Why must he go? It is his duty, child, her mother said gently. Do not be sad. Wish him well, and we will pray for his success. Florence held out her hands. Goodbye, Mr. Dormer. I will miss you so much. I will never forget you. Frank smiled sadly. You promise too much. You will be happily married long before I return, if I ever do. Florence looked at Frank in shock. If you ever come back? Do you mean we will never see you again? Mama, is he serious? Tears filled her eyes, and she began to cry. Frank felt troubled by her sadness, but gently led her to her mother, who watched with concern. For a few minutes, Florence could not stop crying. The thought of never seeing Frank again was too much for her. It feels like death, she whispered. Losing someone you love with no hope of seeing them again. Mr. Dormer spoke too quickly, Florence, her mother said kindly. If he has dear friends here, he will return one day. Now say goodbye again and go to bed, or you will keep me awake all night. Florence obeyed, but as she said goodbye, her sad eyes made Frank forget himself. He hugged her and kissed her forehead. Then, turning away, he covered his face with his hand until she left the room. He then faced Mrs. Harriton. Forgive me. You don't know how much I care for Florence, how much it hurts to leave her. I may never. He stopped, unable to continue. Mrs. Harriton spoke gently. Be hopeful. If you work hard and succeed, Florence may still be free when you return. Then, you can ask her father for her hand if you still wish. Frank's face lit up with hope. Do you really think Mr. Harriton would allow it? He asked. I know you are trying to encourage me, but I could never be equal to Florence. Mrs. Harriton sighed deeply, pressing her hands to her chest. Life changes, Frank. Florence may face hardships too. I fear for the future. In a few years, who knows where my child will be? Her voice was so soft that Frank leaned in to listen. She took his hands in hers. Frank Dormer, she said seriously, I will be gone long before you return. But I trust you. If Florence were older, I would be happy to see you marry her. But I have no power to decide. I have always been weak. Promise me one thing. If my child ever needs help, you will be there for her. I swear it, Mrs. Harriton, Frank said, bowing his head. She whispered a blessing and, feeling too weak, called for her maid. As she had feared, it was their last meeting. Before Frank left at sunrise, he received a small package. Inside was a miniature painting of Florence and her mother, with a note that simply said, Remember. That same day, Mr. Harriton also left. He said he had business in Morpeth, but later, Mrs. Harriton learned he had been seen boarding a coach to London. Days passed without news. Mrs. Harriton tried to stay patient, though she feared the worst. 2 days later, she sat in her chair while Florence sat at her feet, sadly talking about Frank. A servant entered. "Ma'am, 2 strangers have arrived. They wish to see Mr. Hareton." I told them he was out, but they refused to leave. Florence looked curious. "Are they friends of Papa's?" Mrs. Hareton's heart sank. "Go to your room, Florence. Mark, show them in." Florence hesitated. "Let me stay, Mama. You're not well." "I will be quiet and respectful." "No, this is business." "Please go," her mother said firmly. Florence left, but unwillingly. The moment the men entered, Mrs. Hareton knew her fears had come true. She forced herself to stay calm as they spoke. Mr. Hareton had invested too much in the failed company. Now the family had lost everything. The men had come to take possession of their home. Mrs. Hareton did not argue or complain. She gave instructions to the servants and remained quiet. But when the men left, the truth hit her like a storm. "My child, my poor Florence," she cried. Florence, who had been waiting nearby, ran to her mother's side. She found her pale and motionless in her chair. "Help!" she shouted. "Mama has fainted. If only Papa were here." The servants rushed to help, trying everything to wake her. A stranger who had stayed behind checked her pulse, then turned to his companion. "God help that poor girl," he whispered. "There's no need for a doctor. The lady is gone,